The screen lit my face like a cold street lamp. I held my phone and watched his message appear again, only this time the words were different. Can we meet tonight? It's urgent. It was from Mark. My chest tightened. Mark and I had been together 3 years. He said he loved me every morning. He left kisses on my neck like stamps. He said our life was stable, safe. I told myself to breathe. I tapped back. Okay. When? He typed, now. At the cafe on 5th. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment without thinking. The city smelled like rain. I ran. At the cafe, Mark sat with a woman I did not know. She smiled at him the way people smile when they own something. Mark smiled back like a practiced act. My heart tripped. He stood when he saw me. His face changed from warm to sharp in a second. He reached for my hand, but the woman took his other hand first. Jane, he said, but his eyes were elsewhere, flat and tired. The woman laughed at a private joke. I realized I had been late to the truth. The waitress brought coffee. The woman said my name like a secret and leaned close. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. We need to talk about us. The words hollowed out everything. I asked myself how I could stand there and not scream. I did not know then that the moment would not end with the cafe. It would be the first crack in a story that would topple his whole life. I walked home like a ghost. Every step felt heavy. My mind replayed the scene at the cafe in slow motion. The woman's hand on his arm. The way he avoided my eyes. The words he had mouthed. I unlocked the door to our apartment, and the silence hit me like a wall. Mark was not home. His coat was gone from the rack. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon. I opened the bedroom door and found the bed made neatly, as if no one had slept there. My phone vibrated. A missed call from Mark. I listened to the voicemail and heard him say, I'm sorry, Jane. I'll explain later. His voice was soft and empty. I pressed my palm to my chest and felt the faintest tremor. I wanted answers now. I paced and then I sat. I pulled up our shared calendar and scrolled back. There were events, meetings, dinners. His life laid out in neat blocks, like a machine. None of it hinted at the woman. I opened his laptop. He would hate that. He always said privacy mattered. But I needed to know. The browser had tabs open about travel and investments. Nothing personal. Then an email notification popped up. A note for Mark and Partners. I clicked. The message was a press release draft, Mark's name in the header. I read it twice. It announced a new partnership with a charity and a tech firm. The charity was reputable. The tech firm had a glossy logo. But under Executive Liaison, there was a different name listed. Someone I had seen at the cafe. The cheat was one thing, the lie was another. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. That night I slept on the couch, and the apartment felt like a stranger's house. When Mark came home, he tried to hug me. I flinched. His cologne filled the doorway. He said, Jane, we need to talk. He sat on the couch like he was preparing a speech. I listened, but my ears were numb. He spoke about stress at work, about meetings and decisions. He said the woman was a consultant, nothing more. He used small words, softly. He asked me to trust him. I saw him searching my face for belief. I wanted to give it to him. Instead, I asked, why were you holding her hand? The question landed like a stone. Mark's face hardened. He called it a mistake to meet her then. He blamed poor timing. He said he was confused. He said, I made a stupid choice. He promised it would not happen again. He asked for forgiveness. He talked about our plans, buying a house, traveling next summer, the dog we joked about. His voice tried to rebuild the life we had. But his words did not match his actions in that cafe. I watched him and felt the room tilt. I knew I should be angry or loud. Instead, I felt thin, like a paper that could tear with one wrong move. I thought of our private jokes, the nights we held each other in the dark, the time he told me about his father. I thought of how many times I had chosen to believe him. His apologies sounded real enough. But after midnight, when he slept and the apartment hummed with the sound of city traffic, I sat up and opened my laptop again. I needed proof, or else I would be the woman who let the story slide and teach herself to forgive without reason. I pulled up bank statements, messages, anything that might show how deep the lie ran. A single email thread stood out. Long threads about funds, contracts, and a line saying, confirmed donation released to partner. The woman's name appeared again. This one passed a drink at a cafe. It smelled like a scheme. I followed the thread. The charity's name in the email looked legitimate, with a nice logo and a smiling mission statement. But beneath the surface, small red flags prickled my skin. A donation request with no tax ID number. A new tech firm registered for only a few months. I clicked deeper. The tech firm's website had polished photos and big promises, but the address led to a mailbox service. The charity's registration was thin, no public records. My stomach dropped. I printed the emails and statements. I read them until the paper blurred. The language was clinical. Transfers, escrow, liaison. Most chilling was a memo with Mark's signature approving a transfer. The number startled me. Not just a few thousand, this was 6 figures. I remembered brushing his shoulder, saying quietly, "You shouldn't have to explain everything to me." He had smiled and kissed my forehead. I had been kind. That kindness had a cost. I wanted to believe he had been naive, but my gut said something worse, that Mark had used his reputation to move money. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the house growing lighter, the city waking. At 7, I called my sister, Anna. I told her I needed help and to meet at the courthouse. Her voice was steady on the phone. "Bring everything," she said. I hung up and zipped the papers into a folder. As I stepped out, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face looked different, sharp around the edges, eyes awake. I wanted to confront him, drag the truth into the open. But sudden anger can be a blunt thing. I had to be precise. Anna met me outside the courthouse with 2 coffees and a fierce look. She had always been blunt. We sat at a bench, and I laid out the papers. Her fingers traced the numbers like they were a map leading to a pit. "This is not a mistake," she said after a long pause. She had an accountant friend who could look at the transfers. We drove to his office together. In the car, Anna kept asking, "Are you sure it's Mark? Are you sure?" I repeated the names and amounts until my voice felt coarse. The accountant, Luis, wore old glasses and a patient manner. He flipped through the printed statements, and his face changed. "These transfers go to shell accounts," he said, "and the timing lines up with his travel. Someone set up a front to hide the money. This is deliberate." The word deliberate lodged like a pebble in my mouth. We left with a plan. Luis would do a deeper audit. Anna would help me organize the timeline. I would keep my cool around Mark while collecting more proof. I felt both hollow and oddly focused, like a person walking a long, straight road. When I returned home, Mark was in the kitchen, pretending to make breakfast. The smell of toast felt like teasing. He asked about my day. I smiled and said, "Fine." He seemed relaxed, proud of being a calming presence. I set my phone to record. I would not let him catch my anxiety. I pressed play on the recorder and told him I had errands. He kissed me and left. As the door closed, I felt the first true crack form, the knowledge that I was preparing to betray him back with facts. Not to hurt for the sake of pain, but to make sure the world saw the truth. For a week I lived 2 lives. During the day I was careful and warm, making dinner and asking about his meetings. At night I dug. Luis's report arrived in my inbox like a thunderclap. He had traced the transfers to companies that dissolved within months. He had found patterns, donations that circled back through payment processors to an offshore account. The report used words like conduit and malfeasance. My stomach turned. It suggested laundering. I printed page after page. Now the risk was bigger than marital betrayal. It smelled like crime. I felt trapped between my love and the law. I began to set small traps to watch Mark's reactions. A mention of the charity in casual conversation, a text about an upcoming meeting. He answered predictably, calm, rehearsed. Once he mentioned an innocuous client by name, and I Googled that client. The results were empty. He had cultivated an image of success that looked whole and clean, but under it was a messy web. One night Mark came home late. I pretended to be asleep, and then turned on the recorder when he fell into bed. His phone buzzed with a call labeled bored. He answered like a man caught mid-song, smooth, practiced. He used words like asset allocation and release schedule. The tone was not a lover's whisper, it was a manager's command. He talked about needing to move money quickly to meet obligations and mentioned a lawyer's name I had never heard. I tucked the recorder away, heart pounding. The next day I called the lawyer's office posing as a reporter. The receptionist said the lawyer had never worked with Mark. A lie. The puzzle pieces were throwing themselves at my feet. Luis advised caution. If this is criminal, he said, you need documented sources and legal counsel. He recommended I reach out to an investigative journalist friend he trusted. My hands trembled as I typed the message. The journalist, Claire, replied within an hour. Her tone was sharp. She wanted facts, and she loved a story that exposed corruption. She asked for papers and timelines. I sent everything. Claire called me that night, excitement in her voice, but also a cautionary edge. If Mark is who you think he is, this will be huge, she said. But be careful. People lie on paper. I told her about the cafe. I told her about the woman's laugh. She asked for names. I realized I did not have the woman's full details. Claire said she could dig. Meanwhile, Anna and Luis worked on a timeline of transfers. The more we found, the more it looked like a house of cards. Mark's role on the company website as a trusted executive gave him the credibility to move funds with forged approval. I felt sick and furious. The next morning, Mark kissed me goodbye and said, "Try not to read bad news before bed." He laughed. I kept my face calm. That afternoon, Claire emailed. She had found the woman's name tied to a shell company in another state. The woman had a clean social feed full of staged photos and 2 perfect charity selfies. The image clicked into place. This was not a fling. It was a system. I sat down on the floor and breathed. I had drifted into a strange clarity. I was no longer only a hurt girlfriend. I was someone holding a match near a kindling pile. Claire's research sped up the story. She found invoices that matched the dates on Luis's timeline and traced them to an events company that staged charity galas. The events company worked with PR firms that inflated donation numbers to attract wealthy donors. Occasionally, the company funneled a small sum to real causes to keep appearances. The rest evaporated into accounts no one could touch. Claire said this was common, reputation laundering. Mark's signature appeared on 2 invoices that authorized transfers to that events firm. The woman from the cafe was listed as a program manager for one of the fake charities. Claire called her, carefully, posing as a donor, and got a voicemail that sounded staged. She left a message. The woman didn't call back. Claire warned me to be careful with confrontation. People can get violent when cornered, she said. I heard fear in her voice and felt my own pulse race. That night I confronted Mark with a simple question. What is program manager on that invoice? He laughed and said the title was meaningless, a freelancer. He deflected and tried to flip the script, accusing me of mistrust. I had crafted a calm face for this moment, but when he touched my shoulder, something inside me snapped. I whispered, "I will find out." He tightened his jaw and left the room. I watched him go and then called Claire. She said she could lure the woman into a recorded conversation by pretending to be an event sponsor. I felt sick at the idea of trapping people. But this wasn't about entrapment, it was about truth. The next day, Claire asked me to join a sting at a charity brunch. I told Anna and she agreed to come. We had to be ready if Mark tried to move the accounts again. The brunch was staged to look like generosity. I sat at the back with Anna and Claire. The room smelled like roses and polished shoes. The woman arrived with a group and scanned the room like a chess player seeing an open file. She smiled at Mark, who was on a panel. He introduced her as a partner. She mouthed something I could not hear. After the panel, Claire approached them with a fake donation check and a recorder in her sleeve. The woman played along. Her voice was syrup smooth as she talked about impact metrics and sustainable giving. Claire steered the conversation toward invoices and payment timelines until the woman slipped. She mentioned a private payment platform. Claire pushed and asked for details. The woman named a company that matched the events firm. Mark laughed, but I noticed sweat on his upper lip. He reached out and put a hand over the woman's hand. The gesture looked like ownership. I felt rage, but I swallowed it. Later, Claire pulled me aside. She had enough to tie the woman to the events firm and had recorded incriminating words. But she wanted more, a document with Mark's signature approving a specific transfer. We needed something with his hand on it, literally, or digitally signed by him with his credentials. Anna suggested we ask Mark to help with a mock charity drive under the pretense of saving face. He would sign paperwork to show support, and we could capture it. It felt like lying, but the law sometimes requires such steps to expose the lie. I felt hollow but resolute. That night I sent Mark a text asking for his help organizing a small fundraiser for a real cause. He agreed readily. The plan moved forward. I set the trap carefully. The fundraiser would be small, for a children's literacy program I genuinely liked. I told no one at work except Anna and Claire. Mark was delighted to help, too delighted. He talked about speeches and donor lists like a man rehearsing his image. On the day, I asked him to prepare a simple authorization form for funds, something that would allow him to sign as liaison. He did it with the practiced ease of a man who signed papers daily. I watched his hand on the pen, the way his fingers curled like they had done it 1,000 times. He signed and smiled at volunteers. I kept my voice steady and asked him to scan the form and email it to me so I could forward to donors. He did it. The email came through my phone. His attachment had his name, his title, and a note. I saved it to my folder like a trophy. Later, Claire listened to the brunch recording and matched phrases with the woman's statements. The signed form had the exact authorization language that appeared on one of the invoices tied to the event's firm. The lines connected. It was proof. My hands shook as I stared at the document. In the evening, Mark sat beside me, oblivious to the folder on the table. He said he was proud of the day. I felt like a person with a loaded camera pointed at a stage actor. I had always believed in private forgiveness, in giving space to mistakes. But this felt like a theft beyond pardon. I did not speak. I did not smile. I simply gathered the documents and closed them in a locked drawer. The next morning I sent the file to Claire and Luis with a short note. This changes everything. The next days blurred into work and quiet preparation. Claire began drafting an expose outline. She wanted to confront Mark publicly only if the evidence was airtight. Luis expanded his audit and found a link between Mark's travel dates and transfers to accounts used by the events firm. It was a pattern: move funds, stage events, pull money through middlemen. The charity donations were a smokescreen. The headline Claire whispered to me made my throat close. Trusted executive accused of fraud. I felt sick and electric at the same time. One night, Mark asked if something was wrong. I told him I was stressed about work, and we talked about mundane things. He softened and kissed my forehead. That tenderness pinched the part of me that still loved him. I wondered if love and justice could exist together. The day came when Claire wanted to meet Mark with the story. She planned to give him a chance to comment. I said I could not face him in public yet. Claire understood. She proposed an alternative, an anonymous tip to a regulator with a packet of documents and a demand for an inquiry. It felt like a clinical act, a needle. We submitted the packet. Within 48 hours, an investigator called Claire and asked for more. The regulator had opened a preliminary probe. I felt both relief and fear. If this went public, Mark's reputation, built over years, would crumble. I thought of his mother, his friends, the way he checked his hair before meetings. I thought of my own family and how this would look to them. The next morning, Mark's phone lit up with email alerts. He came to me and said, "My company is getting regulatory interest." His voice was sudden and small. I met his eyes and did not blink. When the regulator contacted Mark's firm, the office fell into a hush. I watched the news like a person watching a slow-moving train wreck from a distance. Board members whispered in corridors. Mark's name was on a list of people to be interviewed. He tried to act unaffected at home, but his hands fumbled with keys. He grew defensive, asking me to delete anything I had. I told him I had nothing. He believed me, misplaced faith. The company conducted internal meetings, and Mark took longer and longer calls. I watched his stress carve lines into his face. One afternoon, a courier delivered a thick envelope for me. Anonymous, no return address. Inside were photos, Mark with the woman at several events, his hand on the same documents we had found, his name on checks. The photos were candid, as if taken by someone following him. Fear hit me. Someone was already watching us. I called Claire, who told me to be careful and to copy everything to a secure drive. The regulator interviewed Mark and asked about specific transfers. He answered like a man defending a castle, claiming paperwork errors and miscommunication. The firm placed him on leave pending the inquiry. He sat on the couch in our living room one night, clutching a mug, asking me to believe him. I felt for him in a small, human way, But then the news released another piece. A vendor had come forward with emails showing Mark's direct approval of transfers. The evidence multiplied like dry tinder catching. That night I could not sleep. I imagined the moment when Mark would no longer be able to hold up the mask. The firm released a statement acknowledging an internal review and promising full cooperation with regulators. Social media caught fire. Colleagues messaged me, some supportive, some shocked. A few of Mark's friends called, asking if I knew anything. I told them a neutral lie, the only kind that felt safe. I don't know much. People believed him less than before. The woman from the cafe disappeared from her online profiles. Mark lashed out at the company publicly, writing a defensive email that circulated and then leaked. His tone was angry and wounded, but to outsiders it sounded like arrogance. The board convened and asked for deeper documentation. The firm released lists of payments and noted errors in process. Those errors pointed directly to authorizations signed by Mark. The regulator issued a request for materials, and Mark's name came up in media stories. He went to interviews, seeking to clarify. I watched him on a live broadcast one evening. His image flickered across my laptop screen, hands clasped, voice steady. He stated he had been transparent and would cooperate. But behind the scripted answers, his confidence began to look thin. The public flinched at every evasive phrase. I felt a quiet power then, like a current running through me. The truth was making its slow, inevitable path. I began to get messages from former donors and clients who were angry and felt betrayed. A woman whose organization had received a small grant called me, crying that she had used the funds for a health clinic. "We thought it was real," she said. The guilt in her voice hit me. We had all been actors in Mark's play. Some real good had been done, but built on lies. I thought of how often we forgive brilliance because it dazzles us. I stopped making excuses for Mark's charm. I stopped imagining a neat explanation. Claire wrote an explosive piece, citing invoices, photos, and testimony. It hit the internet like a storm. The article named Mark and explained the pattern. The firm's stock dropped. Clients paused contracts. The board initiated an emergency call, and Mark's email inbox filled with cold messages. He phoned me that night, voice raw. "Jane, they will come after you. They'll say you knew." I told him the truth. I had gathered evidence and passed it to a regulator and a journalist. He was silent for a long time, then he whispered, "Why?" I looked at him and felt something like pity, small and private. "Because the world needs to know," I said. The next morning his mother called my parents, voice trembling, demanding to know how this could happen. My family's dinner turned quiet. We all felt the ripple. Mark's allies tried damage control. They leaked that he was a scapegoat, a man targeted by rivals. They produced alternative documents claiming some transfers were approved by others. It became a battle of papers and statements. I watched as lawyers circled in like birds over a carcass. The regulators subpoenaed accounts. Mark resigned under pressure. He called it a pause for personal matters. The board called it a step to preserve integrity. The press painted him as a tragic figure. Some people sympathized. Others were unforgiving. He lost clients and speakers who had praised him a week before. The woman from the cafe surfaced with a short video denying wrongdoing and blaming a misunderstanding. People who had once celebrated Mark now whispered. I watched his reputation collapse like a building with a weak foundation. Mark came home less and less. When he did, he walked like a man carrying the weight of the world. He asked me to stay, to help him navigate. I refused, not out of cruelty, but because I believed truth should stand on its own without my voice to prop it up. He looked at me as if I had stabbed him, and I felt nothing but resolve. The city outside kept moving. Inside, everything that mattered had changed. The legal battle began. Mark hired lawyers who were smart and sharp, their clothes immaculate. The firm fought to minimize the damage. The regulators' investigation widened and subpoenaed communications. People we used to know were called in to testify. I was nervous when my name was mentioned in a legal notice. My phone buzzed constantly with messages that felt like knives. Mark sent me long, pleading texts, sometimes begging, sometimes furious. I read them and folded them into a drawer like bad mail. The day I was called to testify felt like a heartbeat stretched too long. I sat under a bright light in a room that smelled like coffee and detergent and told the truth. I answered questions about dates, signatures, and meetings. The lawyer representing Mark tried to discredit my findings, calling me biased and vengeful. I kept my face neutral. I told about the cafe, about the brunch, about the signed authorization form. The room hummed. Outside, protesters gathered, some calling for Mark's arrest, others holding signs like due process. The court of public opinion raged as the legal one moved slowly. I watched Mark in the hallway, and he looked smaller than he had on the screen. I felt no triumph. I felt the weight of everything that happened and the fragile possibility that justice might be messy. That night, a new leak changed everything. Someone released internal emails showing that top executives had known about some questionable transfers and had not acted. The story expanded beyond Mark. It suggested systemic failure. The board scrambled to distance itself, firing a few people and announcing reforms. The media turned from a single villain to a rotten tree with many branches. That shift made me uneasy. I had wanted the truth to reach beyond one man because the harm was wider. But I also feared that the story would become diluted, that accountability would be scattered thinly. Claire wrote a follow-up piece that named the executives involved and the patterns of cover-up. The public reaction was ferocious. Shareholders filed suits. Regulators announced larger probes. Mark's name was still central, but now it was clearer that arrogance and greed had roots in a culture of silence. He became a symbol for a failing system. I watched him wrestling with lawyers in meetings and felt the slow erosion of his spirit. One evening, he sent me a message. "If this ends badly, remember we had good times." I read it, closed the app, and let the silence speak. As trials began for a few key players, the evidence piled up. Testimonies came from former colleagues who described pressure to deliver results and to not ask questions. The events firm's owner pleaded guilty to fraud. The woman from the cafe, once a thin image on social media, was subpoenaed and under oath, admitted to roles she had hidden. Her voice shook as she explained the chain of transfers and how she had been promised protection. She said Mark had signed documents and used his authority to move funds. Hearing her name confirmed in a cold room felt like a verdict. I sat quietly and felt my hands loosen their tight grip on the past. The courtroom drama aired on the news. People debated whether Mark was a mastermind or a man who had been seduced by his own success. But the facts sat still. His signature, the invoices, the emails. The public's appetite for scandal was ferocious. Mark's old friends abandoned him. Some reached out privately, ashamed. Others spoke to the press. The firm settled with several clients. Mark faced civil suits and potential criminal charges. I sat on my balcony and watched the city at night, lights flickering like distant stars. I felt an odd emptiness, relief mixed with sorrow. Justice was moving, but it had a rough, noisy way of doing its work. Mark's father, an elderly man with a reputation for philanthropic work, gave an interview asking the public to remember the good Mark had done. He spoke about the son he loved. The police stirred some sympathy, but the story had become bigger than a single family. More testimonies came forward about projects delayed and communities harmed. The regulator released a preliminary report citing negligence and reckless approvals. The language was clinical and brutal. Investors withdrew, and the firm slumped. Mark's identity was no longer safe behind titles. He was a named example of how power can blind kind people into making terrible choices. He called me less often now. When he did, he spoke in short fragments, asking for updates on his legal team. Once, he begged me to help him find a statement that would make people forgive him. I refused. If forgiveness was to come, it had to start with truth and accountability, not spin. The court issued a freeze on some accounts. Mark could not access certain funds. That finality felt like a closing door. I had imagined that when the truth came out, he would be angry or repentant. Instead, he grew quieter, almost small. The civil suits moved faster than criminal charges. Clients sought damages. The media followed every court filing. A deposition of Mark revealed his internal emails where he had dismissed concerns about vetting vendors. Those emails were blunt and careless. The defense tried to paint him as overwhelmed, a CEO whose hands were full. The prosecution, public scrutiny, showed that his signature carried weight and that he had used it. The woman from the cafe testified about pressure to create evidence of social impact, metrics, photos, staged events to reassure donors. She described how Mark's name opened doors. The simplest truth was cruel. People trusted him. He had used that trust. Watching the hearings, I felt a range of feelings: anger, pity, and a steady calm that came from being on the side of facts. People who had once praised Mark for mentorship now removed his posts from their feeds. One former mentee wrote a public apology for not looking harder. The community reeled. I received messages from people thanking me for exposing the fraud, strangers whose charities had been harmed. I answered none of them for days. I was tired. Justice is a long, loud thing. Summer waned and the trial dates arrived. Mark's lawyers negotiated settlements for some clients while criminal probes continued. One day, the court unsealed documents revealing offshore accounts linked to meetings Mark had attended. The details were granular and ugly. I sat in the gallery during one hearing and watched him in a suit that suddenly looked too big. He hardly met my eyes. At one point he mouthed, "I'm sorry, but the courtroom is not a place for whispered apologies." The prosecutors showed how money moved from corporate accounts into event budgets, then into shell entities. They called expert witnesses who explained how reputation can function as collateral, allowing a person to move funds on faith. It felt like an anatomy lesson on trust. Outside, protesters demanded accountability. People whose projects failed stood at microphones, telling journalists about children's programs delayed and families left stranded. None of it erased my own private memories, the small good moments we'd shared. But now those memories were threaded through with betrayal. I left the courtroom and walked home under a sky that felt empty. The verdicts were mixed. Some executives pleaded guilty. Some cases were dropped for lack of evidence. Mark faced civil judgments that would take years to settle. Criminal charges were still pending, but the public consensus had shifted. He had lost his position, his accolades, and much of his social standing. For some, the end was a warning tale. For others, it was a tragedy of a capable man who had fallen. Mark's reputation, once a shield, was now the evidence used to show how easily trust can be weaponized. I watched the final hearings as a quiet spectator. I did not gloat. I felt a kind of tired sorrow. On the day Mark signed papers for a settlement with a major client, he left a note on my kitchen counter. "I regret everything. I'm sorry for the hurt." I read it and folded it and put it in a drawer. There were no fireworks, no dramatic confessions, just the dull sound of a life being repacked. Months passed. Allurex, my new company, where some of my old colleagues had gone, sent me a message asking if I would speak at a conference about ethics. I hesitated but agreed. The day I stepped onto the stage, people clapped in a polite way. I told the story not as revenge but as a caution. I spoke about how charisma can hide harm and how checks must be real. People listened. After the talk, strangers thanked me. One woman hugged me and said she had been defrauded and that seeing the truth made her feel vindicated. That night I walked home and felt more whole than I had months ago. It was not because I had destroyed Mark's reputation. It was because truth had safety built into it. I had helped bring accountability where harm had been allowed. Mark would have to live with the consequences. Sometimes justice is quiet and slow. I received a letter one morning. It was from Mark's attorney offering to meet and discuss post-settlement terms. I opened it but felt an odd calm. The city had changed too. People moved on. Some still whispered at cocktail parties, but the storm had passed. I met Mark once for coffee. Public, short, polite. He looked older. The man I had loved was split apart by choices and headlines. We did not try to repair what had been broken. We simply acknowledged the ruin and agreed to live separate lives. He said, "I wish I had done things differently." I said, "So do I." The conversation felt like finishing a book with a sad, honest last page. I left the cafe with a weight lifted off my shoulders. It was not pleasant. It was necessary. The years that followed were quieter. Some charities recovered. Some people rebuilt. Mark's legal troubles faded slowly from headlines, but never fully disappeared. He found work in a small nonprofit, far from the boardrooms he once commanded. People who knew the whole story treated him kindly but cautiously. I met someone new eventually, a person steady and honest, not dazzling and not loud. Love returned like a slow tide. I kept my folder of documents in a fireproof box and visited it sometimes to remind myself why I had acted. I did not celebrate the ruin. I sought accountability and repair for those harmed. When I look back at the night in the cafe when I first saw him with the woman, I do not see a villain with one face. I see a man with choices, some cruel or careless, and a system that lets him use trust as currency. The truth destroyed his entire reputation, yes, but it also revealed the fractures in many places. In the end, I learned that honesty is a slow, relentless force, and that standing up for it can reroute more than one life.